Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marcia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, will the tug of war between the West and Russia die down or heat up? This as elections will take place on Sunday in the separatist eastern provinces of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, millions of ballots have been printed to elect prime minister and a political party which will choose further our future ministers and parliamentarians. Moscow says it will recognize and respect the results of the election. The United States and the EU says they will not recognize the election and call them illegal.
Workers at polling stations put finishing touches to ballot boxes prepared for the November 2nd elections in the east of Ukraine. The residents of self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics will go to the polls on Sunday to choose their lawmakers and new leadership. Moscow, that's backed the aspirations of the two rebellious regions from the very start of the conflict, says the vote will boost the legitimacy of the local authorities.
We
consider the vote as one of the most important points of the Minsk Peace Pact. We expect the elections will go ahead as agreed, and we will of course recognize the results. We are counting on it being a free vote and that no one from the outside will try to stop it from happening.
Russia's rival in the West, the US and the EU and NATO have warned it against recognizing the elections. Washington claims the vote runs contrary to Ukraine's constitution, and NATO says Russia's actions are threatening the region's security and stability.
Russia's actions in Ukraine are in breach of international law. They have severely damaged trust, and they pose a major challenge to our Euro-Atlantic security. In the Middle East and in North Africa, ISIS and other extremist groups are spreading violence and instability. And returning foreign fighters pose a risk to our own security.
On the ground in the east, shelling and fighting between pro-Russian forces and the Ukrainian army continue, despite the September peace deal between the feuding sides. Authorities in East Ukraine hope that the elections will increase their legitimacy.
We would hope the vote would be recognized. We have invited the maximum of international observers so they would have an opportunity to make their own conclusions about this election. The elections don't violate any norms or laws despite all these statements.
After last week's parliamentary elections in Ukraine, President Petro Poroshenko vowed to unite the country. But what remains to be seen is what the ramifications of the Sunday vote will be for Ukraine and for the relations between Russia on the one hand and the US and the EU on the other.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, the founder of StopImperialism.com, Mr. Eric Dreitzer out of New York, and columnist of The Hill out of Washington, D.C., Mr. Brent Budowski. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in Washington with Mr. Budowski. Well, according to the United Nations, there have been more than 4,000 people killed in the separatist regions during the last 7 months. If recognizing the vote would help end the violence, why wouldn't the EU and the U.S. recognize the results of this election?
Well, the vote violates the ceasefire agreement between Ukraine and separatists. It violates international law. It violates the Ukrainian constitution. It violates the commitments made by every party to this. The election will not be recognized by Europe. It will not be recognized by Ukraine. It will not be recognized by Eastern Europe. It will not be recognized by the United States. It will be not recognized by virtually anybody in the world. So if President Putin thinks he's going to grant some legitimacy to this, he'll be singing in a theater to an empty audience. It will not be recognized by anyone, and it's illegitimate. And the result will be that you're going to end up having more sanctions, more pain for the people of Russia, more tension throughout the region. They can hold elections every single day they want in eastern Ukraine in November. It will not count. It will not be recognized. It will make things worse, and they should stop it.
What about that, Mr. Dreitzer? These elections are illegitimate, according to our guest in Washington.
Well, what the guest in Washington fails to bring up for viewers is the fact that the ceasefire has long ago been thrown to the wayside because, of course, Zakharchenko and the Ukrainian forces, the Kiev regime, fired missiles into Donetsk no more than 2 weeks ago in violation of that said ceasefire. At the same time, we should also recall there is no constitution in Ukraine. Remember, the constitutional authority as it was existing before February 21st, 2014 has gone out the window with the violent overthrow of the democratically elected, albeit corrupt oligarch Yanukovych. There is no real constitution, and certainly not one that is recognized by the people of Donetsk and Lugansk, who have been the victims of a brutal campaign that has been waged against them by Kiev, which is, of course, a puppet government of the United States, handpicked by the United States, as the Victoria Nuland phone call, as a number of other pieces of evidence quite clearly indicate. And so this is sort of a misnomer to say that these elections are illegal, while the elections in Kiev, which were held under conditions of war, under conditions of intimidation and voter suppression, somehow those are legitimate. Remember, the United States is recognizing the elections of last week and not recognizing these elections. And the reality is because it needs to legitimize the puppet government that it created in Kiev while simultaneously delegitimizing the forces in Donetsk and Lugansk. And the reality is very clear. There is a war being waged by Kiev against the people of the East. Those people who have had their linguistic rights attempted to taken away from them, who have been violently intimidated by Right Sector and other Nazi organizations. These people feel under threat, and they feel utterly
stay with me, Mr. Dreiser. Let me get Mr. Bodowski back in on this. Let me stay with me, sir. Let me cross back over to Washington. Mr. Bodowski, what about that? It appears, as our guest is saying in New York, that the West is picking and choosing which elections they will accept, which ones they won't, which elected officials they will accept, and which ones they won't. We see, if we go back to the previous president of the Ukraine, Mr. Yanukovych, as our guest has said in New York, perhaps corrupt but elected official. On the one hand, the West did not accept him. He was basically overthrown, many would say a coup. Now, in the eastern regions, these people want to hold elections, and already they're saying absolutely not, no way, it's illegal. Are there double standards here?
Well, as Ronald Reagan once said, there he goes again. I mean, he didn't answer the gentleman in New York one point that I raised. And I'm not surprised, because he can't answer, because there is no answer. The government election in Ukraine a week ago was under the law of Ukraine. The election, or pseudo-election, or phony election being held in eastern Ukraine is against the law of Ukraine. It is against the ceasefire agreement. It is against international law.
Did the people of East Ukraine have any say in the creation of those laws?
Please, let me finish. No, let me finish. We're in America now, so I talk and then I listen when you talk, but you listen when I talk, okay? The election that was held by the Ukrainians under Ukrainian law was legitimate and was recognized by most countries around the world. The election, pseudo-election, phony election that will be held by the separatists in violation of the law, in violation of Ukrainian law, in violation of the ceasefire agreement, I repeat, will be recognized by no one. Now, if my colleague and Vladimir Putin want to be the two people in the world that recognize it, that's fine with me. But you'll be singing to an empty chorus. There'll be nobody in the theater listening to that. There'll be nobody in the world who believes it. It is an illegitimate election. It will be recognized by no one.
Mr. Dreiser, go ahead. You wanted to comment, sir.
Well, this is typical of the arrogance of so-called Western journalists, or I would call them hack journalists, who repeat the talking points of the White House and the State Department. The reality, once again, I will repeat, as I did earlier, there is no ceasefire in Ukraine. It was violated by Zakharchenko and the Kiev forces when they fired missiles into Donetsk. That ceasefire agreement does not exist. The Constitution that you're referring referring to does not exist, in the sense that it has never been recognized by any authority other than the puppet regime in Kiev, certainly not by the people of Donetsk and Lugansk. Let me also add, the two most popular political parties in Donetsk and Lugansk have traditionally been the Communist Party and the Party of Regions. The Party of Regions and the Communist Party have both been violently suppressed, de facto disbanded, under the violent oppression of Kiev, that is to say, the right sector thugs and others. Now take a look at these elections that this gentleman is holding up as some kind of beacon for the world. You have 20% of the vote going to Poroshenko and the oligarch bloc. You have 20% going to Yatsenyuk and the pro-EU neoliberal bloc. And you have roughly 15 to 20% of the vote going to outright Nazis. And that would be the Radical Party of Lyashko. That would be the Opposition Party. That would be the Self-Help Party. These organizations are run by Nazis. And you can laugh and deny it all you want. You can call it Russian propaganda, but that merely shows the ignorance that you have towards the subject. The reality is, if you want me to go through individually, piece by piece, who these political parties are, I could do that.
All right, stay with me, sir. Stay with me, sir, Mr. Dreisler, and also Mr. Budowski. Let's cross over to our Facebook page and see what some of our viewers have said about this subject.